Ramiro Vargas leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, his fingers tapping restlessly against the polished mahogany desk. The view from his office was vast, overlooking the sprawling compound that served as the heart of his empire. A thick veil of night had descended, and the moonlight cast an eerie glow across the land, the silhouette of armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Ramiro's mind, however, was miles away, focused on a more immediate threat, one that had started to grow just beneath the surface of his life. The empire he had meticulously built over the years was strong, unyielding, but there was a sense of unease gnawing at the back of his mind. His wealth, his power, his control over the cartel, none of it seemed as secure as it had once been. It was Isabel. His wife of 10 years, his partner, and the one person he thought he could trust. Isabel was beautiful, a woman of grace and intelligence, someone who had stood by his side since the beginning. She was more than just his wife, she was his confidant, his anchor in the stormy world of cartels, corrupt governments, and endless violence. She knew the inner workings of his empire, the deals, the betrayals, the bloodshed that kept the wheels turning. But recently Isabel had changed. She had begun to withdraw, her once radiant smile replaced with a far-off look that never quite left her eyes. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared plans for the future, had become strained. Isabel had started to question things she wasn't supposed to know, things that weren't meant to be uncovered. Ramiro's thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the door opening. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Isabel entered the room, her movements hesitant as if she were walking on eggshells. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen as though she had been crying. The sight of her made his stomach tighten. This wasn't the Isabel he had married, the woman who had never shown weakness, who had always stood by him no matter the cost. "Ramiro," she said softly, her voice trembling as she spoke his name. There was a faint catch in her breath, as though she was holding back something that threatened to spill out. Ramiro's gaze sharpened, his instincts immediately alert. Something was wrong. His pulse quickened, his fingers tightening into fists as he sat up straight in his chair, focusing entirely on her. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low, though there was an edge to it. Isabel had never shown fear before, but tonight she seemed small, vulnerable even. This wasn't like her. Isabel hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting around the room as if she were searching for the right words, the right way to explain the discovery she had made. Finally she pulled something from her purse, a small manila folder, and placed it gently on the desk between them. Her hands were shaking as she did so, but her eyes remained locked on Ramiro's. Ramiro felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He didn't need to look at the folder to know what was inside. His heart skipped a beat. The accounts. The ones he had kept hidden, the ones that no one was ever supposed to know about. Accounts that were meant to launder money that flowed freely between corrupt officials, smugglers, and other powerful players in the world of crime. "I know about them, Ramiro," Isabel said, her voice almost a whisper now. "I know about the accounts. The ones you've been using to move money around. The ones no one was ever supposed to see." Ramiro's mind went blank. His blood turned to ice. He had been careful, so careful. No one was supposed to find out about the money laundering, no one was supposed to see the hidden accounts. Not even Isabel. He had kept her in the dark, told her only what she needed to know. But now everything was crumbling. Isabel knew. And once she knew, there was no going back. His gaze flicked to the folder on the desk. Isabel didn't make a move to open it, but Ramiro knew exactly what was inside. The proof. The evidence that could bring down everything he had worked for. His empire, his business, his freedom, it could all fall apart because of this one discovery. Isabel's voice broke through his thoughts. "Ramiro, how could you? All these years you've been lying to me. I thought we had built something together. But you were hiding things from me. I deserve to know the truth." Ramiro stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked to the large windows, his back to Isabel, trying to control the seething anger that bubbled to the surface. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, threatening to spill over. "This is not how it was supposed to be," he muttered to himself. He was angry, but not just at Isabel. He was angry at himself. How had he let this happen? How had he let the one person he trusted most in this world get so close to discovering the truth? He turned back to face her. The look in her eyes was filled with hurt and betrayal and something else, something darker. There was no fear in her now, only resolve. Isabel wasn't just upset, she was angry. Angry at him for keeping her in the dark. Angry at him for the lies, the secrets. "Ramiro, what's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice steady, though the fear was still present, lingering just beneath the surface. You can't keep running from this. The cartel, the money, the people, none of it matters if it all falls apart. What happens to us, to our family? Ramiro's jaw clenched. He couldn't let her tear this apart. He couldn't lose her. But she had already found out too much. Isabel's discovery had set something in motion that could not be undone. He could feel it, his empire, his control, slipping away with every word she spoke. He took a step toward her, his voice cold. You think you can just waltz in here and demand answers? You think you can question me after all I've done for you? His voice grew louder, shaking with the anger that had built up inside him. Isabel recoiled slightly, but she didn't back down. I'm not asking for answers, Ramiro. I'm asking for the truth. You've hidden everything from me and now I don't even know who you are anymore. I can't live like this. I can't be part of this anymore. Ramiro took another step forward, his breath coming faster. The anger was almost overwhelming now. You don't know what it's like, Isabel. You don't know what it takes to keep this empire alive. You don't understand what I've sacrificed. But I've done it all for you, for our future. Isabel shook her head. No. You did it for yourself. You did it for power, for control. You've lost yourself, Ramiro. You don't even see it. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick. Ramiro's heart raced, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to say something, something to make her understand, something to make her forgive him, but he couldn't find the words. Isabel had already made up her mind. And in that moment, Ramiro knew he had lost her. The air was thick with tension as Ramiro led Isabel out of the house, her footsteps hesitant against the cold stone path. The compound, once a place of refuge and luxury, now felt like a cage, its high walls looming ominously around them. The night was suffocating, and the sound of crickets in the distance only highlighted the eerie silence between them. Ramiro's mind was clouded with fury and fear. The discovery Isabel had made could undo everything, everything he had worked for, everything he had built. Isabel had crossed a line, and in this world that could not be forgiven. She was no longer a partner, a wife, or a confidant. She was a threat, a liability, and in this world the weak were not allowed to survive. Beside him, Isabel walked in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had come to confront him, to tear apart the veil of lies he had built around her. But in the end, it wasn't the truth that she had uncovered that mattered. It was the fact that Ramiro saw her as the problem now. She had been a part of his life for so long, but now she was expendable, just like all the others who had outlived their usefulness. As they moved toward the back of the compound, Isabel couldn't help but glance at the shadows. The yard, though pristine and well-kept, felt cold and lifeless tonight. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was almost unnerving. There was a sense of finality in the air, as though the world around them was holding its breath. They reached the large gate at the back of the compound, the one that led to the small training area where Ramiro's prized Rottweiler, Titan, was kept. The dog had been with Ramiro for years, since it was a pup, raised and trained specifically for protection. Titan was no ordinary dog. He was fierce, loyal, and ruthless. There was nothing more terrifying than seeing Titan in action, and Ramiro trusted the animal more than anyone. He had seen Titan rip through men, leaving nothing but shredded flesh behind. Tonight, however, Titan's purpose would be different. Isabel took a step back, her breath quickening as she saw the dog standing by the gate, his massive frame shadowed by the flickering light from a nearby lantern. His glowing amber eyes were locked on her, the low growl coming from his throat sending a chill down her spine. She had heard stories about Titan, but to see the dog in person was an entirely different experience. There was a raw, primal power in his presence, a hunger that seemed to come from deep within him. Ramiro smiled coldly as he watched Isabel's reaction. He knew the fear she felt. Titan had always been a symbol of his control, of his absolute authority. The dog was not just a pet, it was an extension of Ramiro's power. And tonight, Titan would carry out a task that no one else could. You don't have to do this, Ramiro, Isabel said, her voice trembling. She could feel the heat of her fear, her chest tightening with every breath. The dog's growl grew louder, and Isabel instinctively took another step back. Ramiro turned to face her, his expression cold and unreadable. I do have to do this, Isabel, he said. You've gone too far. You knew too much. You've made a choice, and now you have to live with the consequences. Isabel opened her mouth to protest, to beg for her life, but the words caught in her throat. She could see the resolve in his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched as if he had already made up his mind. She had seen this side of him before, but never like this, not with her. Never with someone he had once loved. Ramiro's hand tightened around the leash as he walked toward Titan, who stood still, waiting for his next command. The dog's massive body seemed to tower over him as he approached, its muscles rippling with anticipation. Ramiro gave a sharp command, and Titan immediately responded, sitting obediently at his feet. Isabel's pulse raced. She had heard the stories, how the cartel used dogs like Titan for brutal executions, how they had torn apart men who had betrayed Ramiro. The dog was a weapon, just as much as any of Ramiro's men. And tonight, it was her turn to face the monster. "No, Ramiro," Isabel said, her voice breaking. "Please don't. I never wanted this. I didn't want to know. I only wanted to understand, but not like this. Not this way." Ramiro's eyes softened for a brief moment, the flicker of regret flashing across his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold indifference that had ruled him for so long. "You don't understand, Isabel," he replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I can't have someone like you threatening everything I've built. You've become a liability, and I can't afford to leave any weaknesses behind." Isabel's legs trembled, and for the first time she truly felt the depth of the danger she was in. Ramiro had always been ruthless, but this was something different. This was not just about business. This was personal. Ramiro motioned for the dog to move forward, and Titan's body tensed. With a single, swift movement, the dog lunged, its powerful jaws opening wide. Isabel didn't have time to scream. The moment the dog's teeth sank into her flesh, her world went black. Titan's attack was swift, brutal. Isabel's body crumpled to the ground as the dog tore into her, his massive teeth rending flesh and bone with a ferocity that was almost unnatural. Ramiro stood back, his face impassive as he watched the scene unfold before him. The screams of his wife were drowned out by the savage growls of the dog. It was over quickly. Too quickly. Ramiro felt nothing. He had known deep down that Isabel was a weakness. Her discovery of the accounts had threatened everything: his empire, his power, his control. There was no room for weakness in this world, not when betrayal was always lurking in the shadows. As Titan finished his work, Ramiro stood motionless, his gaze cold and unwavering. The dog had done what was necessary, and in the end, it was just another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Ramiro's grip on the cartel had been restored. But at what cost? Titan, covered in blood, sat obediently at Ramiro's feet, his amber eyes glowing in the dark. Ramiro stared down at the dog for a moment before turning and walking back toward the house. There was no looking back now. Isabel was gone, and Ramiro knew that the empire he had built would continue, stronger than ever. But in the quiet of the night, as he walked away from the gruesome scene, something inside him began to stir. What had he truly sacrificed? Was it worth it? The silence of the compound answered him. No one would ever know the truth. And that was the way Ramiro wanted it. The dawn broke slowly, casting a pale light over the sprawling compound as the sun began to rise. The darkness of the night had given way to a cold, unsettling morning, and the once bustling grounds of the cartel now felt eerily silent. Ramiro stood in the center of his office, his gaze fixed on the large window that overlooked the courtyard below. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so empty. His empire, the one he had spent years building, was no longer a source of pride. It had become a cage, one he had locked himself in with the key long lost. The events of the night still hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating him. Isabel's body was gone, her blood already washed away by his loyal men. They had acted swiftly, just as he had ordered. No one asked questions, no one looked back. That was the way it had always been in Ramiro's world. A world built on fear, loyalty, and obedience. But as the hours passed, Ramiro felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He walked to the small bar at the corner of his office, his hands moving mechanically as he poured himself a drink. The glass trembled slightly in his hand as he took a long sip, the sharp burn of alcohol doing little to numb the chaos in his mind. He hadn't slept. Not since the moment Isabel's screams had echoed through the yard, cut short by the vicious bite of Titan. He had watched it all, standing still as if in some trance, the dog tearing into her without hesitation. There had been no mercy, no second thoughts, just the cold, hard reality of the cartel world. But the silence that had followed Isabel's death had been the hardest to bear. The quiet of the compound felt oppressive. The men who served him, who feared him, went about their business as though nothing had happened. They had always followed orders without question, but there was something different in the air now. Ramiro could feel it, an undercurrent of doubt that seemed to ripple through the walls of his fortress. He wasn't just losing Isabel. He was losing the very thing that had once made him untouchable: his control. Ramiro walked out of his office and into the courtyard, where the scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. He glanced at the guards who stood at attention, their eyes averted as they sensed his presence. No one spoke, and Ramiro appreciated the silence. It gave him space to think, though his thoughts were clouded, fragmented, and disjointed. He had always been a man of action, decisive and calculating, but now his mind felt slow, bogged down by guilt and regret that he couldn't seem to shake. He needed to focus. He couldn't afford to lose his grip on everything now. The cartel was his life, and the power he had amassed was not something he could walk away from, not when so much was at stake. Ramiro's mind wandered to the upcoming meeting with his lieutenants. They would expect answers that Ramiro wasn't sure he could provide. How could he explain what had just happened? How could he justify Isabel's death when so many were watching? The crackling of his phone broke his reverie. Ramiro's heart skipped a beat as he pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. The message was simple, short, and to the point. "Boss, the accounts have been cleared. Everything is in place. No one knows about the transfer." The relief that washed over Ramiro was momentary, but it was enough to steady his nerves for the time being. The money laundering scheme had been secure, the hidden accounts untouched. Isabel's discovery had been a near miss, but she was gone now, and the threat of exposure was over. There was still work to be done, still people to be controlled. The empire wouldn't run itself. But as the words of his lieutenant echoed in his mind, Ramiro realized something. Isabel had known. She had known the truth, the secret that had always been the bedrock of his empire. She had known about the accounts, about the illegal dealings that had kept him at the top. And now, with her gone, there was no one left who could challenge him. No one left who knew what he had done. Ramiro looked up at the sky, his thoughts clouded with a sense of finality. The cartel world was a dangerous one, a world built on trust and betrayal, power and weakness. And in this world there were no second chances. As the morning wore on, Ramiro found himself becoming more detached from everything around him. The weight of Isabel's death was starting to feel heavier, the guilt settling in like a stone in his stomach. He had done what he had to do, he told himself. She had been a threat, a danger to everything he had worked for. But still the questions lingered. Did he really have to go this far? Was there any other way? And if not, where did that leave him now? A man who had killed the one person who had once been the closest thing to family. What had it all been for? The silence around him seemed to mock his uncertainty. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the man everyone feared, the one who made the rules. But now, standing in the courtyard, surrounded by the cold, impassive faces of his men, Ramiro realized that control was an illusion. It was something he had clung to for so long, but now it seemed so fragile, so easily shattered. Later that day, when his lieutenants arrived for their meeting, Ramiro greeted them with the same cold demeanor he had always shown. His eyes were sharp, his mind focused once again on the business at hand. The weight of his wife's death was still there, but he knew that in this world, emotion was a luxury he could no longer afford. The men gathered around the table, their eyes flicking to Ramiro as he sat at the head, the silence of the room thick and suffocating. They were waiting for him to speak, waiting for their orders. Ramiro cleared his throat, his voice firm as he addressed them. "The operation is moving forward as planned," he began, his tone cold and businesslike. "We've secured our position. The money has been transferred and no one is the wiser. Any threats to our operations must be dealt with swiftly and without hesitation." The men nodded in agreement, their faces neutral, their expressions betraying no emotion. Ramiro's words flowed smoothly, and for a moment, he almost believed the lie he was telling himself. Everything was fine. Everything was under control. But deep inside the cracks were beginning to show. The uncertainty was gnawing at him, growing stronger with each passing minute. Isabel's absence was like a shadow that hung over him, a constant reminder of what he had lost, and what he had destroyed. As the meeting came to a close, the men stood and filed out, leaving Ramiro alone in the room once again. He remained seated, staring at the empty chair across from him, where Isabel had once sat. The weight of her absence was suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late now. The damage had been done. Isabel was gone and there was no going back. Days passed in the compound, the steady rhythm of daily operations returning, though everything had changed. The weight of Isabel's death, though buried beneath layers of work and leadership, lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Ramiro moved through the motions of his life, meetings, deals, threats, executions, but it all felt distant, like he was watching his own life unfold from a great distance. It was as if he had left himself behind the moment Isabel's blood had stained the dirt of the courtyard. He was still the same Ramiro Vargas, still the boss, still the man everyone feared. But the edges of his power, once sharp and unwavering, were beginning to fray. His empire, once a fortress built on trust and loyalty, now seemed fragile, as if every stone was precariously balanced. The betrayal of Isabel had shaken something deep within him. She had known the truth about his dealings, and the thought of her knowledge circulating beyond their walls gnawed at him. Even in death, Isabel had threatened his grip on everything he had fought for. Ramiro's eyes darted across the room as he paced in his office, his thoughts tangled with fear. The fear was insidious, creeping into his every decision, every glance. The men who worked for him were loyal, yes, but what if they began to question his authority? What if they started to see the cracks in the foundation of his rule? It wasn't an unthinkable notion. In the world of cartels, the balance of power could shift in the blink of an eye. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and everything could fall apart. And Isabel had been that moment. Ramiro paused in front of the massive window overlooking the compound. His mind raced with thoughts of enemies both within and outside the cartel. The death of Isabel would inevitably raise questions. Questions from his own men, from rival factions, and even from those who had once been allies. Was she really a threat? Could he have handled it differently? He exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the mounting anxiety. No, he had made the right choice. There had been no other option. Isabel had to die. She had discovered too much, and in this world, knowledge was more dangerous than anything else. But even as he convinced himself of this, a voice in the back of his mind whispered that something had changed, that his empire had already begun to crumble in ways he couldn't see yet. The air in the office grew thick, and Ramiro's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. Without waiting for a response, one of his lieutenants, Alejandro, stepped in. Alejandro was one of the oldest members of Ramiro's inner circle, a man who had been with him from the very beginning. He was a steady presence, always calm, always collected, even in the most chaotic of situations. But today, as he entered the room, there was something in his demeanor that made Ramiro pause. Alejandro closed the door behind him and walked toward the desk, his footsteps deliberate and measured. His eyes, usually calm and unreadable, held a hint of unease. "Boss," Alejandro began, his voice low, "I need to speak with you. It's about the situation, with Isabel." Ramiro's stomach tightened, a cold shiver running down his spine. He had expected this moment, but he wasn't ready for it. Alejandro had always been loyal, too loyal to ever question Ramiro openly, but the tension between them was palpable. Ramiro took a deep breath, trying to mask the dread that clung to him like a second skin. "You've noticed the men," Alejandro continued, his gaze flicking toward the door as if to make sure no one was eavesdropping. They're talking. Whispering. It's not like before, boss. There's a different atmosphere around here." Ramiro's jaw tightened. The fear of losing control, of appearing weak, surged in him like a tidal wave. He leaned forward, fixing Alejandro with a hard stare. "What are you saying, Alejandro?" Ramiro's voice was low, but it carried a weight that made Alejandro hesitate. "The men are loyal. They know their place. If they're talking, it's nothing. Just rumors." Alejandro hesitated before speaking again, the words coming slower now, as if he were treading carefully on dangerous ground. "It's not just rumors, boss. It's more than that. I've heard them questioning you. Wondering why things were done the way they were with Isabel. People talk. And when people talk, the foundation starts to shift." Ramiro stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a loud noise. The fear Alejandro had mentioned was real. It was spreading, creeping into the very walls of his empire. For the first time since Isabel's death, Ramiro felt the sting of vulnerability. "You want to question me too, Alejandro?" Ramiro snapped, his voice sharp. His hand curled into a fist, the tension in his body barely contained. "Do you think I don't know what needs to be done? Do you think I don't know how to keep things in line?" Alejandro flinched slightly, but he didn't back down. "I'm not questioning you, boss. I'm telling you that the men are questioning everything. They're worried. We all know how this business works. We can't afford cracks in the foundation. If the men start to feel uncertain, they'll start making decisions on their own." Ramiro's pulse raced, but he kept his expression unreadable. He had always controlled everything, the cartel, his men, even the very air in the compound. His word was law. But now, with the seed of doubt planted, he could feel his grip slipping. "I will handle it," Ramiro said, his voice steady once again, though it carried an edge. "I always do. You don't have to worry about me, Alejandro." But as the lieutenant turned to leave, Ramiro couldn't shake the growing unease that gnawed at him. His empire was not as solid as it had once been. The men weren't just questioning Isabel's death, they were questioning him. And if they started to doubt him, if his power was called into question even once, the entire system could collapse. Ramiro returned to his desk and sank into the chair, rubbing his temples. The shadows of doubt had grown into something more tangible now, something he could feel in his bones. Every day, every decision, every glance from his men felt like it might be the moment everything fell apart. The cartel world was built on blood and loyalty, but loyalty had its limits. Power was a fragile thing, and those who held it were only ever one step away from losing it. Ramiro had always understood this, but he had never truly feared it until now. His fear wasn't about losing everything he had built, it was about what would replace it. In the back of his mind, a single thought kept repeating itself: what if I'm not enough anymore? The days that followed felt like a blur. Ramiro threw himself into his work, keeping his meetings frequent and intense. He needed to prove his strength to his men, to prove that he was still the man who held the reins of this empire. He couldn't afford any more doubts, any more questions. But as the whispers grew louder, Ramiro realized something. Fear wasn't enough to hold an empire together forever. Fear could make men obey, but it couldn't make them loyal. And without loyalty there was nothing. By the time the sun began to set on another quiet day, Ramiro knew he had to make a choice. The fear of losing control had already consumed him. But would his actions be enough to silence the growing unrest, or would they only make the fracture in his empire wider, more impossible to repair? The following days felt like a slow, suffocating descent into a world Ramiro could no longer control. The compound, once filled with the hum of activity, the shuffling of men, the bustle of cartel business, had quieted to a strange stillness. The usual tension that hovered in the air, the expectation of power, of imminent danger, of everything hanging by a thread, had shifted. There was a palpable sense of unease that settled over everything like a thick fog, and Ramiro couldn't ignore it any longer. He had thought that Isabel's death would be the final act that cemented his rule, that the violence, the decisiveness, would reaffirm his strength. Instead, the opposite was happening. His power, once unquestioned and absolute, now seemed fragile, slipping from his grasp like water through his fingers. Ramiro had always known that loyalty was key to maintaining control over his men, but he hadn't understood how quickly that loyalty could evaporate. Isabel's death had not only created a vacuum in his life, it had opened a crack in the foundation of his empire, one that he had failed to notice until it was too late. As the days passed, the whispers among his men grew louder, and Ramiro's once unshakable authority was now being openly questioned. He could hear it in the way they spoke about him behind his back, in the subtle shifts in the way they looked at him when they thought he wasn't paying attention. Alejandro had warned him, but it wasn't just Alejandro. Ramiro could see it now in the eyes of every lieutenant, every trusted hand who had stood by him for years. They were afraid of him, yes, but they were also growing disillusioned. And that was something more dangerous than fear. Disillusionment bred doubt, and doubt was the first seed of betrayal. Ramiro sat in his office one evening, the only light coming from the soft glow of a lamp on his desk. He stared at the stack of papers in front of him, dealings, contracts, accounts, but his mind wasn't focused on any of it. His thoughts kept drifting back to Isabel. The decision he had made, cold and final, had been about survival. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it felt like the first domino had fallen, setting off a chain reaction that would lead to his inevitable downfall. He could feel it. There was no hiding it. There was a shift in the cartel now. He was no longer just Ramiro Vargas, the untouchable cartel boss. He was a man who had made a choice that had cost him his humanity, his family, and now, it seemed, his empire. A knock on the door jolted him out of his thoughts. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. Alejandro entered the room, his expression unreadable as always, but there was a stiffness in his posture that Ramiro didn't miss. It was as if the walls between them had suddenly grown taller. "You've been quiet lately, boss," Alejandro said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of something more. "Too quiet?" Ramiro said nothing at first, letting the words hang in the air. He knew what Alejandro was implying. The silence, the distance, it wasn't lost on anyone. And now the cracks were starting to show. "You think they're ready to challenge me?" Ramiro asked, his voice low and steady, though he could feel the simmering rage just beneath the surface. He couldn't hide it anymore. He couldn't hide the fear, the uncertainty. Alejandro hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door as if weighing his words carefully before speaking. "They're questioning things. And when people start questioning, they stop looking at you the way they once did. You've been unpredictable lately, boss." We all know what happened with Isabel, but we also know how it's affected everything. We can't ignore the signs. Ramiro's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he stood up from behind the desk. What signs? He demanded, though he already knew the answer. He didn't need Alejandro to spell it out. The men were questioning his judgment, his leadership. They saw weakness where there had once been none. You've lost your edge, Ramiro, Alejandro said, his voice softer now, though the words hit like a blow. And I'm not the only one who sees it. There are others who think that maybe, just maybe, you've become a liability. The words stung more than Ramiro cared to admit. He felt the sharp pang of betrayal in the pit of his stomach, but he couldn't show it. Not to Alejandro. Not to anyone. His entire life had been about controlling perception, controlling the way people saw him, the way they feared him. If they saw weakness now, it was over. Ramiro's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He had spent years building this empire, fighting for everything he had, and now, in a matter of days, it was all slipping away. The realization that his men no longer respected him the way they once had, that they were starting to doubt his ability to lead, filled him with a rage so intense it was almost suffocating. He leaned across the desk, locking eyes with Alejandro. I've always known what I was doing. I don't need them questioning me. I don't need their loyalty. If they can't see the bigger picture, then they're not worth my time. Alejandro remained silent for a long moment, his gaze steady but filled with a sadness Ramiro had never seen in him before. Alejandro had always been the pragmatist, the one who saw things clearly, without the emotional weight that often clouded Ramiro's judgment. But now, even Alejandro was speaking to him with a caution he hadn't seen before. You're not invincible, Ramiro, Alejandro said, his voice quiet but firm. There's a price for everything. And you've already paid a heavy one. But power doesn't last forever. Not even for you. Ramiro felt the blood drain from his face. He had always been aware of the risks that came with his lifestyle. He had always known that power was fragile, that there were no guarantees in the world of cartels. But to hear it from Alejandro, his trusted lieutenant, struck a chord in him that he couldn't ignore. The realization was terrifying. The power he had worked so hard to amass was not invincible, and neither was he. Alejandro didn't wait for Ramiro to respond. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the office. Do what you need to do, boss. But remember this, when men start to doubt you, when they begin to look for weakness, it's only a matter of time before they act on it. And then it's too late. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Ramiro was left standing in the center of the room, his mind swirling with the weight of Alejandro's words. The fear of losing control had become more than just a distant concern. It had become an immediate reality. As Ramiro looked around the room, he realized that this wasn't just about the cartel anymore. It wasn't just about Isabel or the accounts or the money. It was about him. His identity. His place in the world. And for the first time, Ramiro questioned everything he had fought for. Was it all worth it? Had his obsession with power, his need to control everything, led him to this point? He could feel the walls closing in. The very empire he had built, the one that had once been untouchable, was now crumbling under the weight of his decisions. And in that crumbling, Ramiro knew there was no going back. The foundation had cracked, and the betrayal of his power was now a reality he couldn't escape. The days following Alejandro's warning felt like an avalanche rolling over Ramiro's life, unstoppable and crushing everything in its path. The truth, the deep fear gnawing at him, couldn't be ignored any longer. What had once been an empire of unshakable power and fear was now riddled with fractures. Ramiro tried to keep up the facade, to maintain the illusion that everything was under control, but deep inside he knew better. The foundation he had built everything on, his empire, his reputation, his very existence, was crumbling. Ramiro had always seen himself as untouchable, the man who stood at the top of the cartel world. He had fought for every inch of his power, spilled blood for it, and had never once doubted his ability to maintain it. But now, the very thing he had relied on, fear, was no longer enough to keep his empire intact. The men who had once looked to him as a god now saw him as a man who could bleed, who could fall, and who could be defeated. The whispers were no longer just rumors, they were the truth that echoed in every corner of the compound. They had all begun to wonder, is Ramiro losing control? In the quiet of his office, the walls felt as though they were closing in on him. Ramiro sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, but he couldn't focus. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall seemed louder than ever. His thoughts raced, each one more frantic than the last. He thought about Isabel. He thought about how she had discovered the secrets, the accounts that had kept his empire running, and how, in one moment of desperation, he had made the decision to silence her. But now he wondered, had that been a mistake? If he had done things differently, would his empire still be standing? The power he had once held so firmly in his grasp now seemed like an illusion, slipping from him with every passing moment. The people around him, his lieutenants, his trusted soldiers, even his loyal advisors, were looking at him differently. They no longer saw the indomitable force of nature he had once been. Now they saw a man who was just as vulnerable as any other. A man who was capable of mistakes. A man who had been undone by his own actions. Ramiro slammed his fist down on the desk, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let them see him falter. He had to do something drastic, something that would remind everyone of who he was, of what he was capable of. But even as the rage built inside him, Ramiro knew deep down that this wasn't about fear anymore. This wasn't about holding on to control, it was about survival. He wasn't just trying to preserve his empire. He was trying to preserve himself. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to collect his emotions. He straightened up, wiping the anger from his face and replaced it with the mask he had worn for so long, the face of the powerful, untouchable cartel boss. The door opened and Alejandro stepped inside once again, his expression grim. "Boss," Alejandro said, his voice steady but heavy with something else. "We've had a problem. A serious one." Ramiro looked up, his heart sinking. He had known this moment would come. He had felt it building in the air, a storm just waiting to break. He gestured for Alejandro to continue. "There's been a shift in the ranks," Alejandro said, his tone clipped. "Some of the men, the ones you've trusted the most, they've been speaking to outsiders. They've been making deals behind your back." Ramiro stood up sharply, his chair screeching across the floor. He felt his blood boil, his vision narrowing. "What do you mean? How many?" "It's not just one or two," Alejandro said, his gaze steady, though his voice betrayed a trace of concern. "There's a faction forming. They're questioning your leadership, and they're looking for an opportunity to make a move. I don't know how much longer we can keep this under control." Ramiro's mind raced. The betrayal was happening faster than he had expected, and the realization hit him hard. He had been so focused on maintaining his power through fear, through violence, that he had missed the cracks growing beneath the surface. His men, the ones he had trusted the most, were now plotting against him. They had seen his weakness. They had seen that he was no longer the man they feared, and that, to them, was an opportunity. "What do we do?" Ramiro asked, his voice low and dangerous. "We handle it before it gets out of hand," Alejandro replied, his eyes narrowing. "We need to move quickly. If we don't act now, we risk losing everything." Ramiro nodded, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. This was it. His empire was slipping away, and there was no room for hesitation. He had to take action, immediately and without mercy. He turned toward the door, his mind already formulating a plan. He couldn't afford to waste time. He needed to show his men, his enemies, that Ramiro Vargas was still in charge, that he still had the power to destroy anyone who threatened his rule. He had built this empire from the ground up, and he would burn everything down to protect it. Even if it meant turning on the very people who had helped him build it. As he walked down the corridor of the compound, the weight of the decisions he had to make settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about maintaining power. This was about survival. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Ramiro entered the room where his top lieutenants had gathered. The air was thick with tension, the men shifting uncomfortably as he walked in. Their eyes fell on him, but there was no longer that look of blind respect in their gazes. It had been replaced with wariness, and Ramiro could see it in the way they held themselves, like wolves ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. He stood in front of them, his presence commanding the room. His fingers twitched at his sides, his mind calculating the best course of action. "Gentlemen," Ramiro began, his voice steady but cold, "I've heard the rumors. I've seen the doubts. You think I don't know what's happening behind my back? You think I'm weak?" The room was silent. No one spoke. "I'll tell you this right now," Ramiro continued, his eyes scanning the men in front of him. "I built this empire from nothing. And I will destroy anyone who tries to take it from me." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "If any of you have been plotting against me, if any of you think you can challenge me, you'd better make your move now. Because once I find out, there won't be anything left of you but dust." The tension in the room was palpable. The men shifted uneasily and Ramiro could see the fear in their eyes. But fear alone wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed them to know that he would do anything at all, to hold on to what was his. Ramiro's voice lowered, becoming a deadly whisper. You all have your orders. You know what needs to be done. As he turned to leave the room, Ramiro felt a strange sense of finality settle over him. This was it, the moment he had feared had arrived. The men who had once been loyal to him were now a threat. And in this world, where power was fleeting and loyalty was scarce, the only way to survive was to destroy anyone who stood in your way. The cartel was his life and he would sacrifice everything to preserve it. But in that sacrifice, Ramiro knew that there would be no return. His empire was crumbling and he was taking it down with him. There was no turning back now. And in the final collapse of everything he had built, Ramiro Vargas realized that the only thing he truly had left was his insatiable hunger for power, until the very end.